Hello, everybody. We're going to get started shortly because we only have 50 minutes. And CDCs are so big, important, and powerful that we have to make sure we get all the stuff in for everybody. So we're not going to wait too long. If anybody is out in the hallway and they can hear me, we're going to start this session very soon. Okay, ooh. Okay, hi, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Tony Toe, and I'm retired, but I do have a history with community development corporations going back to my student days in Philadelphia. I actually set up a couple of CDCs on the East Coast. And then, of course, I worked in Seattle at Homesite, which was a CDC. We're also a CDFI, or a Community Development Financial Institution, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So what I'm going to do is because there's so much to cover, I'm going to let me, sort of use text, give a very quick, rough background of what a CDC is structurally, so you all understand what it is, where the resources comes from for CDCs, and then we're going to go into, and then a little bit of an update from the historical formation phase to the current market environment. And then we're going to introduce the panel, and then they will talk a little about their organizations, and we're going to have a little dialogue with 3 questions that I will identify later. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And we hope that there'll be time for interaction. So please think about questions that you have, or frankly, I think if we're talking and you have something you want to say, just raise your hand, okay? So, okay. Community development corporations, 501c3 nonprofits. We do have some exceptions in Seattle with public development authorities, PDAs, which are quasi-government. And so there's a little bit of difference, but the similarities that they're place-based. That's the similarity. The difference is that PDAs do not have access to certain resources that CDCs have as a completely private entity. So we were created in the 60s and 70s when all the civil rights, all the rebellions, riots, everything was going on, and they needed to respond to stuff that was going on. There was redlining, so there was a lot of communities that were completely marginalized. No capital was going in to these communities, and in fact, they were getting sucked. They were used for market, selling bad products in these communities, but no dollars ever went back to these communities. So that's sort of the history of CDCs. So CDCs are tied into capital investment in underserved, distressed, marginalized communities, typically low income, typically people of color, ethnically, culturally different from the majority in this country. That's sort of the background. And also some rural areas. HUD is the federal overseer of CDCs. The Department of Agriculture is the overseer for the sort of similar CDC version in the rural areas. And I'm not as familiar with that as the urban model. But basically, CDCs, because of this background that I gave you, they're neighborhood-based. We have to have a designated target area with certain compositions. Our board members have to reflect that. So there's a lot of legal, structural bylaws, things that you have to go through to be a CDC. Now, the advantage of doing CDCs back in the 60s and 70s is that there were resources that were set aside, like Community Development Block Grant money, CDBG, home funds. And if you were a CDC, you had a special access to some of these funds, and you had flexibility for using these funds that other people don't have. So that was the advantage of CDCs. And then you use these federal money combined with the Community Reinvestment Act, which was also passed at a similar time, which forced banks to invest money in areas where they were taking deposits. Okay, so the special federal dollars, primarily CDBG and home funds, and some other federal monies, but primarily CDBG and home, and CRA dollars that banks had to put back into the community, one leveraged the other, and that was the basis of the capital that was set aside to go into these areas where CDCs worked. And then some foundations, primarily the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, their mission became dedicated to largely supporting CDCs, and the Ford Foundation, in fact, created a national intermediary, which you're all familiar with, LISC, that then went even further. And there are similar other, like Enterprise, NeighborWorks America, I think in the rural areas, maybe RCAC is a similar intermediary, that provided capacity support and capital dollars to do projects. So that's a quick and dirty history of CDC. So the combination of dedicated federal dollars and private CRA bank money then also encouraged local jurisdictions to match that kind of money with local money, and then also philanthropy, which started out as Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. Okay. And then I talked about the national intermediaries. And of course, much have changed in the 60s, because the whole idea of CDCs was that we were in neighborhoods and communities that there was no money coming in. And so the purpose of CDCs was what we call revitalization. The purpose of CDCs was to bring public and private capital and capacity money into communities so that there could be affordable housing, home ownership opportunities, business development, cultural institutions, much more holistic than just affordable housing, but really, how do we build healthy, thriving communities? But things have changed a lot with tech and private equity and just a lot of private money floating around. Gentrification happened. These same neighborhoods that no one wanted to invest money in became very attractive areas because the land was cheap. And so what happened is a lot of, like China, I think Jamie and Gerald's going to talk about Chinatowns all over the US, other communities, gentrification happened. So that's one thing that really changed. I also want to talk about CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions. That's a specific form of CDC that does lending only. So they function as a bank. They do small business lending. Homesite, for instance, does mortgage lending. Okay, so that's kind of the origin story of CDCs and of the panel here. And now what I'm going to do is go through introductions and then do a quick update on today, and then we'll go into questions. So I'll start with Chris. This is in alphabetical order. Chris from the Community Roots Housing.
Thank you, Tony. Chris Persons, I'm the Director of Community Roots Housing. Before I start, I want to say we're really fortunate to have Tony Toe here with us today. Tony is an icon in community-based development, community-based organizing. He's really one of the national heroes in the CDC movement, I would say. So thank you, Tony, for coming out of retirement for this event. Community Roots Housing, formerly Capitol Hill Housing Improvement Program, and formerly the Stevens Neighborhood Housing Improvement Program, started out in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle, which is kind of a well-to-do neighborhood today, but in those days was plagued by a lot of racist, racial redlining, and our organization helped homeowners get money and tools and capacity to fix up their homes and therefore their community. In the 1980s, as more people came back into the Seattle area, we pivoted our focus to acquiring and developing multifamily affordable housing, and today we have, I think it's 48 properties around Seattle, 2 in White Center, 1 that's completed, 1 that's under construction, serving people between 30 and 60% of the area median income. We develop, own, and operate our properties. But the way we do our development is a little different than the way a lot of organizations do development. We really are focused on community with Liberty Bank Building, Africatown Plaza. Our partnership with SCIPTA at 13th and Fur Family Housing gets to how we, as a community development developer, think differently and really think kind of holistically in the community.
Thank you.
Jared Johnson from SCIPTA, and he's co-executive director with Jamie, so they're going to speak.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Jared Johnson, one of the co-executive directors at the Seattle Chinatown International District Preservation and Development Authority. It is a mouthful, so we just call it the PDA or SCIPTA if you're familiar with us. We are a nearly 50-year-old community development organization celebrating our 50th anniversary next year, actually. We own and operate and develop affordable housing in the Chinatown International District. Currently have 8 properties, roughly 600 units, and about 250,000 square feet of commercial and office and retail space. We were set up really in the wake of the building of the Kingdome. Folks remember what that was like. At the time, community leaders and advocates were really concerned about the impacts of the stadium and what it would do to the neighborhood. This is a neighborhood, if you're familiar, which has always been impacted by public infrastructure projects. I-5 coming through completely bisected the neighborhood in the 60s. The building of the Kingdome, the building of the original downtown transit tunnel, streetcar, and the forthcoming Sound Transit 3 line are just to name a few, right? And so when our organization was created, it really was set up in response to advocates who were wanting affordable housing, family housing, senior housing, services, and there is a ecosystem of service organizations that we partner with that serve the neighborhood. So essentially that's what we do. And then Jamie?
The only thing I'll add is, we're at a housing conference, but, I think that the thing with CDCs is that we do more than housing. We like to think about how these folks live within the community, how the community benefits from the residents, how the residents benefit from the community that's surrounding them. So in addition to the housing that Jared talked about in our properties, we also do quite a bit of work within the CID around small business support, advocacy, like he talked about, public space activation, and then just overall addressing the needs of the people that are in the neighborhood, so property owners, business owners, residents, things like that. I'll stop there. There's 2 of us, so we can't take up all the time.
And this is Michael Syrath from Southeast Effective Development, or SEED.
Thanks, Tony. And yeah, a big shout out to Tony Toe, great leader for many, many decades in our sector. Thanks for being here. Southeast Effective Development, or SEED, was started in 1975. We think we're going to be the first to turn 50.
We're 75 too.
You're 75? All right, we're going to arm wrestle for what week we were founded in then. And it was really that part of Seattle that is and was the most racially diverse, Southeast Seattle, a part that had faced institutional racism for decades, the underinvestment. To quote people that were there at the beginning, they talked about dumping low quality affordable housing on the south end, and really was pushing for higher quality resources, investment. 31 community groups came together and said, we want a CDC, a place-based group responsive to community to address some of these issues, some of this underinvestment, and SEED was born. And a lot of the early work was, in some ways, not that glamorous. It was a lot like fighting for sidewalks. It was fighting for walkability so kids could get to school safely. It's fighting for family wage jobs. It's pushing for the resources so that people can stay in community and thrive. Now we're doing work in 3 areas and have for decades, which is arts, economic development, and affordable housing. As Jamie said, we all do housing, but we do other work as well. So that's our response to community for the last 49 years.
Thank you very much. And I want to reemphasize the place-based nature of CDCs. That's very important, that the projects that we do have to not only provide housing for people necessarily, but also use the housing to create stability and opportunity for people to really make the community economically, culturally vibrant. So that's much a holistic approach. So I just want to focus quickly on what's changed since the 60s to now. One thing is Oops, let me just catch up here. Just a second. Okay. So before we get into the questions, there are three challenges that CDCs in Washington State has currently. One is not current, one is historic, which is our Washington State Constitution prohibits the use of public funds for anything other than education, infrastructure, and things that serve the poor and infirmed. So there's very little money in Washington State that could be public money that can be used for economic development, for instance, to help small businesses. They rely exclusively a lot, in many cases, on federal dollars. So that's a huge challenge for CDCs. And even for housing, there's money to do 30 to 60% housing, but there's no money to do, public money to do between 60 or higher. And income diversity is a big factor in community revitalization and community development to serve the businesses and the cultural institutions that also live in the community along with the people. The second thing is that this capital has changed. There's a lot of big money, private equity, and so none of them are regulated to invest in the community. So the hedge funds, private equity, they have trillions of dollars, but they have no obligation to mitigate the impact that they have on small communities, whereas banks do, commercial banks do because of CRA. So one of the things you should think about in terms of advocacy is whether or not some of these big financial capital-driven institutions should also have a CRA-type benefit, because that would be a source of capital for CDCs and for housing and homelessness, for that matter. And the last thing is that there's a lot of family foundations, because there's all these wealthy individuals now, and they want to, do this glamour wealth thing. So they've lost their mission. A lot of philanthropy has become sort of, I don't know what you call it, fashionable things for what the individuals want to do, rather than really focus on sort of the community development things of like the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation and some of the other earlier foundations. Okay, so now we're going to get into the questions. There's three questions. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and then we'll go through it. One is, how does each of your organization, this is to the panel, reflect and serve the community development priorities in your respective neighborhoods? That's the first question. The second question is, what are the specific community development challenges in your respective neighborhoods? And the third question is, knowing that community building can inadvertently drive gentrification, what should CDCs focus on in the coming decades to address the tension of gentrification and revitalization? So we start with, maybe we'll start this way now. Michael, first question, how does each of you, your organization, reflect and serve the community development priorities in your respective neighborhoods in Southeast Seattle?
Thanks, Tony. We do it by listening to community. We do it by making sure we're hearing and comprehending what community wants and then responding accordingly. We obviously can't do everything. So really, in some ways, the work's evolved. In the 80s, it was really focused on family wage jobs. It was making sure the Dairy Gold factory in Southeast Seattle could stay there. And then when a big box retailer that's now called Lowe's Hardware moved in later, it was like, you're going to hire a workforce that is reflective of the community you're serving. It's not going to be just all old white guys working at the hardware store. And so I think those very specific actions can help. The economic development work's really evolved now around the creative economy. It's around supporting artists, wealth building in communities of color, particularly creatives, looking at land ownership. In the arts, it's been responding to communities. They came to us and said, hey, we have this artist collective. Will you help us buy a building and run a gallery? 3 weeks ago, the Columbia City Gallery turned 25 years old, so we celebrated that. So responding to that, every month we write checks to artists who'd sold their work. We bought a performing arts center, and then affordable housing, similar to what other groups you heard in the 80s, as there was this kind of return back to the cities and investment, this idea of we need to fight displacement through affordable housing. So today we have 1,135 apartments, all 30 to 60% AMI.
Jamie and Gerald?
Hello. I think for us, we work in the Chinatown ID. We have a very tight rhombus, I think we decided was the shape of the neighborhood the other day, that we really focus our work in. And for us, we manage our own properties as well as own and develop them. And I think keeping our staff be part of the community from the community really helps us in knowing what are the best ways to respond to the needs of our residents. A lot of our staff, have history in the neighborhood. We hire multilingual staff. Many of them can speak native language with our business owners and our property owners. And that really helps us kind of, keep a pulse on what is going on in the neighborhood, whether it be with small businesses or residents, and kind of what are their questions and fears. We're very intentional about how we engage our community and how we listen to what it is that they might need. We're not always going to have the right answer or have the solution to whatever it is that they're dealing with, like Sound Transit being a great example. I think there's a lot of different opinions of what will be best within our neighborhood as this regional transit hub grows. But I think really recognizing what it is that folks are concerned about and holding that at the forefront of how we serve our community. Yeah, anything to add?
I think part of the point of this session is to maybe encourage some of you all who may consider forming a CDC in the communities that you come from, like what are essentially the benefits, right? And I think for us, given that we're nearly 50 years old, we're small in kind of the development world, but we're pretty large in terms of the impact that we have on the CID. We are in many ways, an institution because we're quasi-governmental, and we can be seen as a reliable partner to government, to the city, to the county, to the state, to funders. We often also act as a place where smaller neighborhood community partners can come to for resources and advice. And we often play that role where we will be the fiscal sponsor for an organization. We will help leverage some of what we can do to assist an organization that we may be mission aligned with. So if that sounds like something that you guys would be interested in doing, and I think that the CDC model is something that could be really good for communities across the state.
Yeah, I agree. I think that community focus is really important. Understanding community priorities and representing community priorities are far more important than your organizational priorities. We're a little different. We started out Stevens neighborhood, very focused on that community. We expanded to the Capitol Hill neighborhood, if you're familiar with Seattle. And a few years ago, we became citywide, but we still do our work with a community-based focus, and that shows itself in projects like Liberty Bank Building, which Liberty Bank Building, if you know the history, was a key bank when we acquired it. But prior to that, it was Liberty Bank, the first African-American owned financial institution, certainly in the Pacific Northwest and maybe west of the Mississippi. So you can imagine the community was very vested in what happened there, and what we did was we named the building after Liberty Bank because members of the community wanted the building named after Liberty Bank. They didn't want it just to be a museum saying, oh, look, black people used to live in this neighborhood. So we used affirmative marketing to make sure that 80% of the residents, when we first laced up the building, were people who had been displaced or who were at risk of being displaced, largely African American folks. We leased the ground floor spaces to 3 small local African American owned businesses. We hired, I think, 10 different African American artists, and the building is inside and out covered with African American art. We preserved elements of the original bank, some of the bricks. The bank vault door is hanging inside the lobby. It's really cool. But we, all of that we did not because we're a real estate developer, because we're a community developer, and the community priorities are more important. when Skipta called us up many years ago and said, do you want to partner with us on what's now called 13th and Family Housing, we said, of course. And they said, well, we want to be the majority owner. We said, of course. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that most developers wouldn't do that an organization like Community Roots Housing does, because we're community focused. And a number of deals we've worked on with small community organizations who have aspirations to be real estate developers, and we work alongside them to help them realize those aspirations. So our White Center Hub project with the White Center CDA is very similar, where we've built a building, or we're building a building that's going to have healthcare and offices for the White Center CDA, and apartments as well. And again, they are the majority owner, and it's very rare to see developers, allowing the community partners to be the majority owners. But that's what gets to like why we're different and how we achieve our community purpose.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
All these mics coming at me. I think what you just heard is many different ways that we all respond to our communities, and I think what's important in that, this is my MSW coming out here, is that part of our work is to be flexible and nimble and respond to what it is that your specific community that you're serving needs. So it's not going to look the same with what we talk about versus what somebody out here in Spokane might talk about. So I think that's really important to remember, is that you're responding as an organization to what you see the need at the time. And I think there's a tension there of trying to be flexible with that, but then also running a stable organization with stable funding and everything like that, right? So just kind of keep that in mind, because that's really important to being that organization that is going to respond to whatever's going on at the time.
Yeah, I just want to highlight a couple of things that was set up here. Chris, I think Community Roots Housing is a model for partnering with community-based organizations and communities where they are not located to build their capacity. I think 23rd and Union is almost like a gem of CDC success. Okay, you have affordable housing, you have market rate housing. There's no way that Earl's Barbershop, Cafe au Vol, a community and restaurant could survive if it was not a mixed income community. And the reality is that Africatown Community Land Trust, effective, I don't think that they're legally incorporated as a CDC, but that's the function that they played. And Liberty Bank allowed them to go on and really start to develop and own their own projects now, like Jackson, 23rd and Jackson, which is a beautiful looking building. So I want to highlight that. The community development part on the housing and the commercial development. What Gerald and Jamie talked about, hiring people from the community. Also, CDCs, our board members have to be part of the community, which is really tough for fundraising. A lot of organizations have board members that can raise money. CDCs have to have money that reflect, board members that reflect community, low-income residents, small business owners. So CDC boards are notorious for not being able to raise money. Okay, so that's a real challenge, but it keeps its political and community capital. So two important things about CDCs. Our balance sheets, our financial balance sheets have to count because we have to do projects, and our political balance sheets have to count in terms of our connections to our constituents. And then Michael's point about hiring, even businesses that you bring in, you want to make sure they hire people from the community. Okay, so we're going to go on to, we're doing really well on time. So any questions so far from the audience? Go ahead. That's our third question. So if you don't mind, that's our third question that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to go to the second question, and then we'll move to that one. Keep that in mind. The second question is, what are the specific community development challenges in your respective neighborhoods? We'll start with Chris on this one.
It's kind of hard to answer that question without answering their question. Right now, with our focus being citywide, financing is one of the biggest challenges. Finding the money for the projects, bringing money into community is really challenging. But, you know, Capitol Hill 50 years ago had areas that were, you know, underinvested. And now Capitol Hill, if you're familiar with Seattle, is definitely not an underinvested neighborhood. So the paradox is that our work can actually lead to gentrification. So how do we, as we're investing our energy into neighborhoods, ensure that we're not actually moving people out? And I think the simple answer to that is we provide affordable housing, and we do affirmative marketing, and we assure that the people who are at risk of displacement are being retained in the neighborhoods. And that's for us. We do multifamily rental housing. I think home ownership and building equity that way is an important, very important part of the puzzle as well. Not kind of a thing that we do, but I think it's really important. But, you know, people are continuing to get pushed out of neighborhoods across Seattle. Rents continue to climb. It's increasingly difficult to stay in cities like Seattle.
Gerald and
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, similarly, I'll just echo all your sentiments on access to capital and building these projects. For us in the CID, you know, we've got parcels, buildings for sale now, some of which have been offered to us as underperforming assets, and we don't have access to capital to get control of them. And I really am trying to push for our neighborhood to get control of some of these parcels before Sound Transit comes in and gets fully built, and then the prices go back up. So that's a major challenge for our community development mission. I would also say, you know, combating the notion, if anyone watches like Como and Sinclair Media, combating the notion that the CID is a dead neighborhood, right? Yes, is it bad? Do we have extremely difficult challenges with the unhoused, with behavioral health and mental health crises? Yes, we do. But that should not just be a community development problem to solve for us and our partners, right? We need more investment from the city. We need more investment from the county in public health. And that adds to the difficulty of keeping some of our buildings fully leased, whether that's residential or the commercial side. So those are some challenges that we're faced with. Jamie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think something that is probably true for people, everybody in this room, is the cost of running an organization or doing business is getting really expensive. Insurance costs, things just to keep your business open. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that with our small businesses in the CID. The cost of, excuse me, the cost of goods, whether or not an insurance carrier will actually carry that business because of where they're located. We're seeing those issues. I think the other thing that we're seeing, you know, we're talking about our organizations being around for 50 years. We're seeing a lot of businesses that we've had in our neighborhood, they're starting to retire. And so we're seeing a big shift in kind of the type of business, the kind of traditional Chinatown business that you would think of is maybe not going to be there because that person deserves to retire, you know? And so like kind of how does that look as that kind of landscape within our neighborhood shifts? And I think that's definitely, there's the post-pandemic struggle that is still happening within our neighborhood, and some of the stuff that Jared just talked about with our safety concerns kind of compound upon those things. And we're in the center of a very fast-growing city, and how does our little neighborhood kind of keep up with everything that's going on across Seattle when we don't have as many resources as other areas may have had? And so that's something that we're definitely seeing as an issue today.
add something? Mike?
Yeah, I think similar to all y'all's, the access to capital, I think, is a big challenge. We all get phone calls, someone saying, hey, I got a property for you, I got a building to sell to you, and we'd love to buy it and keep it affordable, but it's a little bit like get in line with our pipeline. And just that insufficient capital to address the scale of the challenge. I think one we also face is in the 70s, we were down there doing economic development and stuff, and now it's a very crowded landscape. There's so many nonprofits doing affordable housing and economic development in the community. Many of them are excellent groups, doing beloved partners, doing really good work. And it's that question of like, what's your unique role? And if you're thinking about becoming a CDC, I mean, that's a really great question. Like, what would your unique role be? And so for us, it's really that arts and economic development piece. I think another one's around family-sized units. We hear again and again from community. We want 2, 3, 4-bedroom apartments that are affordable. So that's also a challenge, because then the public funders often say that, whoa, that's really expensive per unit to build that. And we're like, go tell that to community. They keep telling us this is what is needed. So that's an issue where in some ways we're just being inflexible. We're saying this is the type of housing that is needed in community, and we're sticking with it.
Thank you.
Tony, can I add something real fast to the capital? It's not just local, state. It's got to be federal. I mean, anybody who's a LIHTC developer in this room, we're building our only mechanism for building affordable housing in this country is based on a 40-year-old tax law, and we have done everything we can as an industry to build as many units as possible, but we need more federal level support for housing and community in this country. And we're going to be grappling with a housing crisis in this country for decades if the federal government doesn't step up.
And I think the community has to become more sophisticated. There's no such thing as racial equity or social equity without financial equity. You need to sit at the table with the developers with the same amount of financial equity as they have. Then you can talk. You can't be sitting there, they got all the equity for a project and you're in the community demanding. You're going to lose. So we need to get sophisticated. There are many tools. We talked about CDBG, home, all that stuff, but that's all because of the huge challenge with housing affordability and homelessness is really diverted a lot of the money. But there are a lot of other products like tax credits that use it for low-income housing, but there are new markets tax credits that you could use for commercial stuff. There's foundations used to have program-related investments, and banks used to have EQ2s, equity investments, where they lend money to CDCs at 2%, 1% for 10 years, and you don't have to pay it back until 10 years later, or typically they will renew it, and that money you can use as your equity. So when you walk up to a developer, there's what Africa Town did on 23rd and Jackson when they got $9 million from one source, and the developer had a gap. The for-profit developer had a $9 million gap to do that project at 23rd and Jackson, and they came in and said, we'll give you the $9 million, but we own our piece. That's what community CDCs should help the community to do. Okay, we're going to get into the third question here and last question. Knowing that community building, and this is all kind of interrelated, knowing that community building can inadvertently drive gentrification, what should CDCs focus on in the coming decades to address this tension? We'll start with Jamie and Jared this time in the middle.
I think that Chris mentioned earlier, affirmative marketing. That's something that we prioritize within our projects, and that's really making sure that the type of ways that we get the news out about our buildings, do application process, have people apply, that we're getting to folks that would not hear about our opportunities in the mainstream way. So we do things in language. We work with community partners. So we're leasing up a building right now where we've hired and are paying community-based organizations that work directly with housing assistants to help folks get assistance in language to apply to our building. And for us, that to us is a priority in making sure that our community is reflected. Like, the people that live in our buildings aren't going to go online and apply for a job. Apply for housing. They're usually hearing it word of mouth through their community, or they're hearing it from other social service agencies that they're working with. So that's one of the ways that we've really seen that it's the most effective in making sure that our communities are the ones that are, finding the housing. You want to add anything?
Again, the question was around challenges, right? With gentrification specifically. Yeah, I mean, community preference is something that is still in its infancy for us. You know, it does pass fair housing. We're attempting to do it. But with the number of units coming online, especially the number of one bedroom and studio units, getting the kind of applicants, residents that we want in our buildings in order to fight gentrification and displacement is making it a little tough. But you know, I think Chris, one of your projects was the first one to attempt community preference. We did it on our last project. We're doing on our next project, and in terms of community partners, I think Jamie underplayed it a bit. It's a big operation. We have contracted, 4 organizations to essentially help us with leasing. So you, service organization that focuses on employment or education or whatever, you have clients that are looking for housing. We essentially pay them $300 per completed application, and it gets them into a pipeline where, you know, it gets a stable resident family into housing, and hopefully that helps us in our fight against gentrification.
I would add family-sized units. You know, 13th and Fir has got 4-bedroom units, 3-bedroom units. We had very little problem leasing that project up at the same time that our studio units are going really slowly right now. But, you know, family-sized units are really important, which means more investment from the public funders. And not to beat a dead horse, but all of this stuff costs money. A unit is in Seattle is approaching $500,000. Rental of commercial space will go for $40 a foot. If you're a small business, you really can't afford that. So there has to be some subsidy to cover that rent. So we just need more federal investment. We need more state investment in housing and economic development.
I'll just say real briefly that, yeah, the tension's always going to be there. You know, your question earlier on was, what community do you listen to? Southeast Seattle also has $5 million homes on the lake, right? So we're very intentional about it's the lower income residents, it's BIPOC residents, it's those facing displacement who we're listening to and centering. And I think, you know, we all do affordable apartments. What's that tension around wealth building? We're talking to our friends at HomeSite about what would a pipeline of our residents who are making $65,000 a year and stable moving into affordable home ownership. What would that look like? What would success look like? And we're looking farther south because a lot of people in Southeast Seattle are getting pushed to South County, to Pierce County. And so we may be responding to that in the future.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I forgot about your question, so thank you for bringing that back up. We do see that tension as well of like, especially when it comes to kind of, I talked earlier about how with our small businesses, a lot of the more traditional businesses are either closing or retiring, and then we're seeing a lot of young API entrepreneurs that actually are wanting to come into the CID. But we recognize that they can get on their phones, they can get online, and they can do these things. And so what we really do focus our efforts on are the non-English speaking kind of tech challenged folks to really help them, especially during the pandemic. I mean, we had businesses that had no idea what was going on because everything was put out online and everything was put in English. And so I think for us, we kind of have different levels of engagement of how we work with folks. Like, you know, sometimes it's just about, you know, you business owner, you can go on your phone, I'm just gonna give you the information, versus you need me to help you walk through the information and like actually understand what it means to upload your financials and things like that. So it's really trying to meet your community members where they're at and like being kind of intentional about that.
Okay, thank you panelists for being so disciplined. So we're going to give us time to open for questions. So I'm down here taking questions, so please use this mic.
Hi, so I live in Seattle, and I know that the tenant organizing within the city has become bigger and bigger over the last few years, and there's no type of housing that is immune to tenant organizing in my experience. And you all are doing a lot of work to ask communities, like the places, what do you need, and then putting those things in place. But as community-based organizations, how do you respond to tenant organizing, if differently, to potentially private, regular nonprofits or public housing?
Can I start on that one? We actually just created a resident advisory council. Right now there are 15 people. They just last month, or was it earlier this month, sort of incorporated themselves, and we're creating a conduit between the Resident Advisory Council and the board of directors for the organization, direct connection to me, so that we can hear the concerns of our residents more directly and react to them and see our residents as our partners in our mission, and instead of people we're serving or annoyances. And so that, that's one way that we're doing it. We have one member of our board that is a resident of our properties, and they bring a lot of perspective to the board meetings and really hold us accountable to our residents.
We have not yet created a resident advisory council, and prior to the pandemic, most of our resident engagement, I think, was really organic. We have staff that live in the community, live in the buildings that we own and operate, and they were essentially the primary source of advocacy on behalf of the residents. What we found during the pandemic was, people weren't talking, people were scared to leave their buildings, and so using some funds from the Seattle Office of Housing and our own dollars, we piloted our own resident services program. And so that really is designed to sit outside of the scope of property operations and really be a resident advocate. It's so powerful to see a resident who can turn to a staff person who doesn't control whether or not they will be evicted, and then to see the benefit of that in terms of overall housing stability. So that's essentially what we've done. And then in terms of just engagement with our board, we do try and recruit residents of the neighborhood to serve on SCPTA's board as well.
Any other questions from the audience? Thank you.
Hello. So the Seattle City Council just passed the stay out drug and prostitution zones that overlap with your neighborhoods. Can you talk about how you're interacting with that policy and what your organizations plan to do?
I think it's not, yeah. So for the CID, the SODA law is the stay out of drug area, and it's specifically focused on 12th and Jackson, 12th and King, for those of you that know Seattle well. We as an organization are not formally engaging with it in terms of having a position. Thank you. I will speak then as Jamie. I am very concerned about it being in place in general. I think that it has history, this policy has history of targeting Black and brown communities, and I also am not convinced that the Seattle Police Department has the resources to actually enforce it. So for folks that aren't aware of this, it's basically saying that if you have, I think, drug history, that you have to stay out of a certain area, and then what happens is then it just gets pushed out to another area, and then they expand it, and then they just keep pushing it out and expanding it. So I do think it's a policy that does not have the resources behind it to actually enforce and actually be effective. Do we have an issue with an open air drug market in the CID? Yes, we do. And I think that there are other resources that we need to be putting forward to address what is happening there and the folks that are suffering with substance abuse issues. I think that it will look better for a couple weeks, and then after that, who knows? Sorry if that's an unpopular.
Okay, I'm sorry we're out of town because I want to respect people's time. But before we go, I want to thank Michael for getting me out of retirement to do this thing.
He thought this was
and
a
also, we
Tacoma.
wanted to see if we can continue this dialogue moving beyond the session. So Michael has a way of doing it.
Yeah, right after this, there's a lunch session. We're going to be in there, and we really love to keep the conversation going. particularly if you're in a community and you're like, I want to think about starting a CDC. I'm in South Everett, where a bunch of developments go in, or I'm in Tacoma, or I'm in the Spokane area, or a place that you might see big change in your community. Come eat with us. We're going to be sitting at the table with the We Heart CDCs table tent. Yeah, I made that. Yeah, so look for us in the lunchroom over there in a few minutes. And yeah, I'd love to keep the conversation going.